Hi, so sorry we are late. Had a bit of technical difficulties. My computer's been freezing up. But I am so glad to be joined today for our May edition of our speaker series by Connie Spence of the Agricultural Fairness Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us, Connie.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I know that you are really knowledgeable about all these farm subsidies and about how all this real corruption, and in all honesty, has really warped politics and warped legislation and made a lot of food that should be cheap not cheap, and food that, or meat and dairy that make no sense to be cheap. So I'm really
Yep.
excited for this presentation, and I'll let
Sure.
you kick it off. Then.
Awesome. I appreciate you having me. And, the NAACP has a history in advocacy. And, when we think about how to change things, we have to get on the ground level of activism. And as an extension of activism is something that sometimes people don't want to pull the layers off of, and that's kind of stuff that may seem boring, like the systemic details, right? So farm subsidies, some people know it on a broad level, but do they know it on a specific level, and do they know how much it affects our lives and even the power structure of the United States and in the world? And so I'm going to go through farm subsidies, the environment, and food equity with the lens of an activist. I started out as a street activist, and I realized that my street activism wasn't quite changing the system while it was changing people and was very symbolic. I needed to learn how to speak the language of my enemy, if you will, or what I wanted to change. And so I am not the type of person, if you saw me, that looks anything like a politician or anything like somebody who's super buttoned up. I have tattoos all over my arms. I'm very outspoken. So I'm going to go through it today, and I want you to feel like you can very much relate to a spectrum of, of a persona that didn't know any of this stuff, 4 or 5 years ago. So here we go. So as an introduction, my name is Connie Spence. I'm a founder and educator of Agriculture Fairness Alliance, as well as Liberation 360. But specific to Agriculture Fairness Alliance, we are a United States lobbying group. We advocate for policy changes that make sustainable plant-based food accessible to everyone at a price they can afford. We empower communities to develop local plant-based ag systems and help farmers align with this mission. Um, you know, Before I get into this, I always like to start off with the why. Why is the food system and food policy important? Why does this matter to us? Well, we're on the brink of a climate collapse, first of all, and we are recognizing every single day, whether it's through stuff happening with police, whether it's stuff happening through the Supreme Court, whether it's stuff happening through politicians, we're very clearly realizing that the people in power either aren't hearing us or they aren't us at all. And so this is where lobbying comes in. Agriculture Fairness Alliance creates a channel of communication for vegans, farmers, environmentalists, and anyone negatively affected by the current unfair food system. And we focus on, I'm going to go through a few of these bullet points on a high level. We focus on accessibility, so making healthy foods like fruit and vegetables affordable and accessible to all Americans. We level the playing field in farm policy so that sustainable and alternative protein that is better for the environment can compete fairly in the free market. I'll explain why I call it leveling the playing field. We try to make the food system more responsive to demand signals and evolving and progressing diets, and giving more power to consumers to choose plant-rich diets, and basically empower them, to avert a climate crisis. We also are trying to reduce the purposeful oversupply and dumping of meat and dairy, which is an artificial demand tactic. We are trying to change that aspect of the food system. We also do this with a giant umbrella of trying to ensure that all of our legislation and advocacy focuses on ensuring that marginalized communities, both from the consumer angle and the farmer angle, are a priority, because typically farm policy and the USDA has focused on only a certain group of people. And what it's done is it's created a huge power structure where marginalized communities end up getting the raw end of it, when we need to make sure that they are empowered by our food system, especially if it's our taxes. So the topic starter: he who controls the food controls the world. Basically, this quote I found in an article a while back describing the food system, and it stuck with me. And it's saying the food supply has been instrumental for defining the haves and have-nots throughout human history. It's the most essential element to safeguard in order to achieve supremacy over another, right? Who controls food ends up having control over people who need to eat. And since it's a basic need, you have to think about all of our basic needs and who controls, our food, shelter, and energy. So we have to start with something pretty foundational to the food system, and that is, what are subsidies? Subsidies really are our taxes. They are, in the United States and in other countries specifically that have followed the United States food system model, subsidies are our taxes used to provide financial assistance, which is otherwise known as welfare, to small, large, and mega farm owners and investors. Subsidies pay for farmers' overhead costs. What are some of those overhead costs? Equipment, water, livestock feed, losses, insurance policies, loan forgiveness, marketing. Whoa, did I just say that our taxes are paying for their losses, and they're paying for their insurance policy and loan forgiveness? We basically we pay for so much of certain farmers' overhead costs that we almost make it impossible for them to lose. And this becomes unfair once you start realizing who is getting the majority of these. So go ahead. I guess I'll keep going. It sounded like you were saying something. So, if really fast, if you were an entrepreneur and you were starting a business, the way that you understand how to price your product or service is based on your overhead costs and how to create a margin, a profit margin that allows you to, not only produce that product, but also give yourself a wage and if you have employees, a wage. And so our taxes are basically paying for all of this. Someone please stop me if you had a question. I just didn't hear it. So when we think about subsidies,
I just want to point out too. I was trying to make a quick statement about the past. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Trying to make a quick statement about the quote in the last slide.
Yes.
About how these subsidies are even more. Oh, sorry, breaking up. Hopefully everyone else can at least. I was just saying that these.
Ryan, for some reason you're breaking up on my end
still
a
can't
lot.
Hear me?
Yeah, I'll hear like 2 words, and then you'll break up when the punchline of the question. Another option is if you want to message me on Instagram, I can repeat your question or statement, and then make sure that everybody hears it too. So I will keep going just until I hear him again. I don't know if other people are hearing him, but I definitely am having trouble hearing Ryan. So just to be clear, subsidized food is accessible food, or the reverse, accessible food is subsidized food. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about every crevice of the United States and world, and you think about what type of foods you can buy at every corner store, every liquor store, every grocery store, ma and pa, or large conglomerate, you will notice what foods are always there. It isn't, if you go to other countries, they also have other foods that are available. And what ends up happening here is that the foods that we subsidize end up being accessible. Now, this would be great if we subsidized everything fairly. And when I mean everything that we should be eating. So the government, the USDA, says we should be eating fruits, grains, vegetables, and protein, and some dairy. Well, it's weird. This is actually an older visual, but this shows like the weighting. Protein and dairy, like basically meat and dairy, get 115 billion of our subsidy support, while fruits and vegetables only get 411 million. That's a tiny sliver. In fact, that's 279 times the assistance for one specific group. Grains, while you might think those grains are a large number, the majority of grains are not produced direct to consumer. They're actually produced as livestock feed. And by the way, the majority of that livestock feed is exported to other countries. So our taxes are subsidizing things that aren't even for direct to consumer and aren't on that plate. Sweeteners and additives, while it isn't specific for livestock, it does show you where our priorities are. I mean, 12 billion for sweeteners and 411 million for fruits and veggies. Sweeteners aren't even on the recommendation on my plate. So what ends up happening is that we should be like, the way that foods are subsidized should be based on how it's recommended for us to eat so that all of those foods can be accessible. Prioritizing our taxes to pay for the overhead cost of livestock feed exports, meaning the feed to feed another country's livestock before our own population, to me is unethical. And even before the pandemic, when you saw lines of cars wrapped around food banks for miles, I don't know if you remember those videos, those drone videos and helicopter videos of people that were hungry and needed to eat, people that were standing in lines in 10-degree weather. We should put a stop on feeding, using our taxes to reduce the costs to feed the livestock in other countries, and start reallocating that for direct to consumer. So what happens when we allocate the majority of our subsidies to even a smaller amount of total farmers? So our population is about 1.5% farmers, and an even smaller amount of those are the ones that receive subsidies. Well, it turns into this farm subsidy millionaire club. And again, going back to the first statement of the supremacy caused in the food system, when you see that only a certain few have all the money, then they all have all the power of the food system, and not just what lands on your table at a certain price, but also what candidates get elected. So, one of the things I want to sort of correlate is that food subsidies really is like a welfare system for farmers. And America has this bias towards welfare for SNAP and food recipients, where they'll say, well, we need to make sure there's oversight and drug testing and make sure that no one's buying cell phones and cigarettes and alcohol with their welfare SNAP benefits, which SNAP benefits per person ends up being like $125 to maybe $400 a month. You have almost no oversight on the welfare system to farmers, the subsidies to farmers. And again, I kind of want to make sure that we don't think that these are small farmers. Oftentimes, these are, like I said, people gaming the system. The Department of Agriculture admitted to $3.7 billion in improper payments since 2004. And that's just what they admitted to, so it's probably a conservative number. Welfare to wealthy farmers, 1 out of every $4 of our taxes went to someone who received more than $250,000 or more a year. Most of these recipients don't live on the farm. They are a farm owner or investor that lives outside of the farm, and they probably, hire people to work as farm hands. And a lot of times, they keep getting increases on how much we subsidize and different programs that we put, because they try to make us feel as though our food system is in jeopardy. And with the amount that of our land we use to export, our food system isn't in jeopardy. It's just, it has to be reallocated to a system where it's not just based on profit, and it's actually based on feeding Americans. Another thing to keep in mind that with this millionaire club is that members of Congress are in fact sometimes farmers, and recipients of farm subsidies too. This becomes really unfair to farmers who grow products not subsidized. And while it reduces the initial cost of meat and dairy, it doesn't necessarily reduce the cost once they oversupply. And I'll sort of go through that. Ryan, I don't know, you had a question before. I don't know if that question came up, but I want to make sure that I get through some of these. So happy to answer or pause on anything. So again, going back to the premise of farm subsidies being the overhead, paying for our taxes, paying for the overhead cost, they are really unfair, and not just from an environmentalist perspective or a vegan perspective or somebody who's on a plant-based journey or the perspective of, say, a community who lives nearby. Almost all economists in the U.S. Oppose U.S. farm policy, and this is a big deal. Basically, think of like one of the largest economist organizations in America. They did a survey, and 85% are in favor of eliminating them, calling them grotesque handouts that are inefficient. And another reason, again, is it goes back to positioning a certain few people that not only get rich by our taxes, but also, aren't making it easier to feed us and giving us better accessibility. More than 80% of our direct payments of our subsidies go to 15 to 20%. The largest 15 to 20% of farms, they don't need this assistance. So we're giving them to giant farms who are profiting greatly and don't need this assistance. And then the other thing, a lot of times farm lobbyists and mega farmers will say, well, they have such great risk. And so with weather conditions and trade conditions and pandemic situations happening, that they have huge risk. Entrepreneurs and businesses in other industries have much bigger risk. In fact, it's over 7%, whereas farm risk is less than 0.5%. So with that said, I want to step into bailouts, because while subsidies pay for all these overhead costs and also insurance policies that help them out when there's losses, beyond that, our mega farmers are addicted to bailouts, and our politicians have been granting them consecutively for many years. And now at this point, what ends up happening is a bailout wipes clean our actual demand at the stores. So you see people who are becoming more environmentally aware, people who you are seeing plant-based companies doing really well. And you're expecting that those losses are being heard so that perhaps we can create more environmentally sound practices. But when you don't feel a loss, you don't change your production the next year. And so bailouts are giant lump payments using our tax dollars to buy back the production that didn't sell. We've had this happen almost consecutively for 10 years, with the biggest ones happening in the last, I would say not this last year, but the 4 years before that. Why doesn't the cost go down when the industry overproduces? Well, they manipulate prices this way, and they end up dumping out and storing unsold food. So it withholds supply to make it seem like that there's artificial consumption. Consistent bailouts lead to this theory of being incentivized to overproduce, because let's just say you're selling 100 vehicles on your car lot, and you have 10 bad years in a row where you're only selling half of that. Well, if you get a bailout all those 10 years, you make more money off of the cars you didn't sell. So you're just going to continue to oversupply as long as you know you're going to get a bailout. The other part of incentivizing, producers or livestock and dairy farmers to overproduce is the overproduce creates destructive growing and grazing that's not even used. So the demographics are really interesting here because I want you to realize you can look at every industry in the USA. The most homogenous industry is the agriculture industry, specifically because these subsidies go to almost 100% of a white farmer demographic profile. And so, it's interesting because that isn't really how farming existed for the last several hundred years. This actually is because we consistently allowed the USDA to have predatorial practices with Black, Indigenous, and brown farmers. And so now we're in this situation where we have almost 100% of recipients of these subsidies and bailouts being white farmers only when there are additional farmers. Don't forget those additional farmers also, brown, Black, and Indigenous farmers sometimes don't farm livestock and dairy, and they do farm fruits and vegetables. So it is also adjacent to the fact that, fruits and vegetables not being subsidized also means that more farmers of color are also not getting, help in that fashion. So why does the help matter? Well, like in the pandemic, for example, when everything shut down, if we're only helping certain groups of people, then the other people who don't get the help end up failing. And so look at this philosophy over time. Hi.
Can I try to jump in? hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully I can say something now. I really appreciate what you've been saying. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you great now.
Great. Finally. So I was just saying before, like even with the quote that you brought up at the beginning, and throughout the whole presentation, that this is about like fairness and not so much about like eliminating farm subsidies.
Correct.
It's about eliminating the farm subsidies that are going towards
one group of people,
harmful practices that are going towards, like you're showing right here, essentially just buying votes, like in just like incredibly corrupt behavior. Like we want to make certain food affordable, healthy foods that are environmentally friendly. We want this to happen. We want to make farming fair. Like we're not like against farmers. I just want to make that clear, especially like speaking on behalf of like our branch of the NAACP. As you said, or alluded to, we started off as Black people being brought here to do a lot of farm work, right? Like, and yet, despite that, we have been excluded from all these sorts of subsidies and all these sorts of benefits and generational wealth that has happened through these subsidies. And people don't think about how these, how, like you were saying, this food plays into how the power over this food and the power
the supremacy
over
structures,
money, exactly, really contributes. And all this, honestly, is so much like slavery. Like the livestock chattel slavery was based on the use of livestock. Like it was based on the same way that humans use livestock in order to do these tasks. It was made out to be that Black humans were inferior to other humans, obviously predominantly white humans, and that they could, just like other animals, be oppressed and commodified in order to do these things. And so all this is very much tied into slave culture too. And I just wanted to highlight that while I had the chance to actually speak.
Yeah, no,
So,
I hope I wasn't not allowing you. I just wasn't hearing you.
no, no, not at all. I just, unfortunately,
It happens
being an
sometimes.
activist, I don't make a ton of money being an activist, unfortunately, and my computer is old. Uh, but thank you for doing this, and let's keep going. I just wanted to make that clear that
Yeah,
about
actually, this is a good, really quick moment to segue into the founding of Agriculture Fairness Alliance. And one of my important board directors, Renee King Sonnen, she's actually a former, her and her husband are former ranchers who switched their farm to a sanctuary. And now, much of her support is being the eyes and ears on the ground of many other farmers who are suffering and need to do the same. And so we definitely aren't against farmers. It's just that the current system is setting up winners and losers and being very precise about it, where they are just related to the livestock and dairy industry. And that's not just today, it has been, since the founding of this country. And so, to your point, even in the name Agriculture Fairness Alliance, our first step is to create a fair and equitable food policy. Once we can do that and start reallocating how our there are taxes, they should be representing us. They should not just be representing just one group of people, and especially, a very small population. So I agree with you on that. And then, yes, I do have some historical sequences in these next slides that talk about the generational wealth being lost, which I think is one of the biggest contributions to, the systemic sort of oppressive practices that perhaps we see today, where when you talk about generational wealth lost, it's not just a small amount of money. It's not like, oh, there was predatory loans and my grandparents couldn't get a house. It's happened multiple times throughout history, and
and
each time it happens to a generation of Black and brown people, they lose everything and then they regain it all, and then something else will happen where the predatorial practice will make them lose everything and start over. So it's this constant start and stop, which is completely unfair.
and if I could just jump in and add a bit, it's even more ingrained than that sort of um, discriminatory like housing policies, because this nation was largely founded in ways to benefit people who had plantations. So it's ingrained in the most fundamental way that um, these things are these things have carried over that generational
For
wealth. Like,
sure.
we may not think of it today as like farmers being like the rich and powerful, but that's who was the rich and powerful at the founding of this nation.
They kind of are, though. If you want to look at some of the richest people, they're all farm landowners. Ted Turner, who controls media, is a giant farm owner. Bezos, purchased Whole Foods, is in partial control of the food system. Bill Gates is also starting to own more farmland. So they all know that if you attach yourself to the food system, you will make incredible amounts of money, especially when the world situation starts having a focal point on your basic needs being met. So I just wanted to point out here that electoral votes are actually very tied to the rural farming community. And so it is a Republican tactic, and it has been. You will always see Republican candidates like really placating to farmers. And in your mind, you might be thinking, oh, well, that's because they're the majority, but it isn't. But it isn't just a Republican tactic. Democrats do this too. An example was Bernie Sanders. He is appeases the dairy farmers in his home state of Vermont. And he's been around for so long in politics that he actually was responsible for creating many of the safety nets that farmers have today that have created this sort of monolith industrialized ag system. So I just want to point out how political it is. Biden just did a bailout and is hosting a session on food in September. It is a huge deal in politics. So how does the population of 1.5% have so much control of our food system and who gets elected? I'm going to breeze through this because we have about 20 minutes, but I definitely would like people to take the curiosity to learn about this stuff. And I'm going to just like pump through and highlight. The founding fathers of this country were founding farmers and created political structures with the belief, seriously, that farmers should have power in America. But that was when 95% of America was rural and stolen. But nonetheless, the majority of our populations now live in cities. And, when you think about the Senate having equal representation of very unpopulated states against states that have huge populations with large cities mean that the Senate is underrepresenting 150 million Americans. And so what ends up happening is that small rural states and even towns have disproportionate power in the USA. And so if you think about a small town mentality, is it as progressive as a big city? And the answer is probably no. But if we didn't give that power to just one group, we'd actually see more equitable farming policy. And the problem is that there's just so much power to one group, which means it silences another. So as we continue on, this creates a structural racism in the food system. 97% of farmers are white. And then if farmers are making a higher than average median income, then essentially we're giving power to a very specific group. CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feedlots, which have a ton of environmental issues, always set up shop near communities with high levels of poverty, and which end up having a large percentage of minority residents. Just to put in perspective, in North Carolina alone, CAFOs are 5 times more likely to be found in majority non-white communities. And not sure if people knew this, but many are actually the same communities as former slave plantations. And so there's just a lot of generational oppression that still exists in that format, to the point you made before. And then the other part is farm laborers and CAFO workers. I mean, they're part of the Latinx community. Many are not citizens. Some do have H-2A visas, which is like a farmer migrant worker status that makes them, legal but not a citizen. They make lower pay, and they literally have no labor rights and will never whistleblow on animal cruelty, environmental violations, and food health concerns. So the U.S. knows we have all these people who aren't citizens working in this environment, and they are not likely to change it, because if they did, you can bet that those things would be called out. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm the worst at like jumping in.
No, go ahead.
So the CAFOs, would you just explain it a little bit more? But before, I just want to highlight again, because we just said it so quickly, but it's just so astounding to think that Black people were, stolen away and forced here to do largely farming things. And 97% of farmers are white.
Yeah.
And then they go out, and so many times they go out to try to justify these subsidies with like making it out as if like there are so many, diverse people doing this, and that it's like you said, small farms and things. And that's just not the reality at all. It's large farms, and it's basically all white.
Yeah, it really is. And it has to do with how the USDA's policy, existed in the last 200 years. And I'll go into how much land and money was lost generationally by Black farmers. Because to your point, whether Black people who lived under slavery and also Reconstruction, both, when land was available, if you think about the work experience they had, they were farming. So it was very natural for them to continue to farm versus go straight north and try to, get into factory working in places they didn't know. And so both of those things happened, but I'm just pointing out it was much more of a natural thing to do for people to get land and start farming. But anyways, on the right, this image shows the H2A, which are documented people but not citizens, increases per year. So you can see that, when you go to a small town city USA and people are trying to talk about building a wall, well, I mean, so building a wall if someone lives in a border community, that means one thing, right? Because you live in a border community and yes, people are crossing the border. But if you're in Iowa and you see a lot of Hispanic people in Iowa and you're assuming because they speak Spanish and don't speak English that they're illegal, like an illegal, I mean, the term, I'm Hispanic, so the term illegal, quote unquote, they really are not. They are legal, documented people that were invited to come here and often were, escorted to these farms to get the less pay. And it has nothing to do with border crossing at all. So I just want to point that out. Okay.
I just want to point out too. Sorry, I don't know if I missed you say it, but I just Googled it. And CAFOS is
Oh, I'm sorry.
concentrated animal feeding operation.
Correct. It's basically a concentrated feed operation has a certain amount of count of animals that are considered a factory farm. And those numbers keep changing, but typically those numbers end up being over thousands of cows in one confined area. For chickens, it's like sadly over 150,000 chickens in one area, which, believe it or not, to me, I think if 5,000 chickens are in one area, that's considered a factory farm. But nonetheless, yes, so these extremely large storage spaces, if you will, that have so many animals in them, typically set up shop, near people they feel have limited political capital, right? So a history of racism and generational wealth loss. So this was what you had brought up, and this is sort of a current Reuters article. Conservatively speaking, U.S. Black farmers lost $326 billion worth of land in the 20th century. This study was done by a very reputable economist group. So I know some people will say, well, that might be biased or this and that. I mean, this is a conservative amount, and I believe it to be conservative because if you look at the amount of acreage, 19 million acreage, had those freed slaves kept that land and multiplied it in the same way that the white counterpart farmer did, you would absolutely see a much larger number than the 326 billion. So I don't want you to think that oh, how did they lose that 19 million acres? It had a lot to do with trying to keep land, working for the products that you grow or animals that you raise over time. So I'll go through that in a second. But anyways, by 1910, 14% of all farm owner operators were Black. So those statistics today don't map out to this. Now less than 1% of farmers are. So these are some systemic causes for losing land and unfair policy. We can dive into this in another session in the future. Perhaps you can, write questions. But I'm going to sort of bounce through them because I think we have like a short amount of time left since we started a little bit late. So discriminatory laws. An example is the California Alien Land Law of 1913. People were going west, and this law prohibited people of color from owning land. There was no labor protections like minimum wage, union rights, or Social Security for Black and brown people working on farms. Land grant opportunities were huge during this time, and they helped white people buy land and farm. The USDA didn't loan Black, Native Americans, and Latinx or women farmers any land or give them loans that helped them with their costs. Homestead Acts gave land to only white people. 93 million people, a quarter of the U.S. population, are descendants of people who received land through Homestead Acts. So So if they received this land and then constantly had loans and taxes that went to help them, they kept this land. So if you think about a quarter of our population is a recipient of generational wealth that was lost from another community is huge. So this number includes farmers today. When you hear someone who says, I'm a fifth, sixth, or seventh generational farmer, this is what it means. And that doesn't mean that farmer has anything to do with that, but it means that their generational wealth was an advantage of being able to receive help from our taxes. So to be clear, this is not the first time we've been in climate crisis. I mean, farmers caused one of the worst environmental crises in history with the Dust Bowl. It was 9 years caused by poor agriculture practices. Grasslands were turned into deserts. The grasslands of the plains have never been the same since. They used to describe the plains as being like prairie grasses and flowers and fertile, and all of that is gone. Basically, they were overplowed to grow wheat. And so what was that wheat for? It was for cattle and then also grazing cattle. So the way the food system is now, I mean, we already learned a lesson back then. We learned a lesson in the Dust Bowl that overgrazing ruins the environment, and we're sort of allowing that to happen again. 35 million acres of farmland were ruined during that time. Environmental consequences of the food system. I mean, 60% of our biomass is livestock. This planet isn't even supporting people. It really is a planet for livestock. And I'm not kidding. Like 4% wild animals, 36% humans, 70% of birds are chicken or poultry to eat, and only 30% are wild. So we're sitting, and again, a planet is basically supporting livestock. And if you think about livestock and livestock feed, I have stats in a later slide, but farming is the greatest cause of loss of wildlife, deforestation, and the number one source of greenhouse gases. Livestock emit a bunch of things that are bad for us, and sometimes you only hear people talking about methane, but the truth is tons of ammonia, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide are in the air, in the ground water. All are contributors to our environmental issues. And livestock.
And
go ahead.
If I could take a sec to mention, and I don't want you to rush too much, because we may
be able to go over.
Have to go off of the actual TV, but we can still go over a bit for river streaming.
Okay.
I just want to say, if you go back a second, I just want to say, and a lot of these things are not included in several GHG greenhouse gas inventories. And so I've been reviewing Chicago's climate action plan. And all of these sorts of contributions from animal agriculture are totally left out. We think of contributions from oil and gas, and contributions from even sometimes soil, but that's also largely to do with still this livestock issue. Whether we are talking about nitrous oxide, which is has an incredibly greenhouse warming potential, but I just want to make it clear that even though we know this stuff, it is still excluded from so many different greenhouse gas inventories.
Yeah.
So even when people are talking about reducing, Chicago is talking right now about reducing all these different things, it's completely ignoring this. Completely.
It also is using biased people to calculate a lot of these. So, there are a lot of groups that are showing that the new calculations of how much livestock emit is like 1/6 of what studies showed before. And it's because you have a totally new group of biased people putting them together.
Exactly.
And so,
especially, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, go too much, but especially when you're also talking about all the food that is produced to feed livestock, and I really hate saying livestock because these are, sentient beings, but all the food that is produced to feed these, that is also a contribution to this greenhouse gas. All the deforestation that happens in order to feed
Yep.
these livestock,
Well,
all these different things.
well, also, piling on, the transportation of all of those things to each other until they get on your plate, the hops of transportation. So think of the oil and gas used to go get the feed, distribute it to these farmers, have the farmers have these feed at this, let's say the cows that you're looking at here. This is a feed lot. And so oftentimes you'll have cows hop to two different lands. So they'll be at the land that they're born on, and then they'll move to a feedlot, and then they'll go to the slaughterhouse. And then once they're slaughtered at the slaughterhouse, then the food is shipped somewhere else. And the amount of hops needed for livestock to get on our plate is immense. I'm actually going to show a video, and I'm hoping that it works. Oh no, let's see if I can go back. This is a video I put together of farmers on TikTok that actually were showing how they dispose of cow waste. And I want you to think about the communities that live nearby. I mean, seriously. That's all manure, and it's not even a large farm. This is a digester. That's a manure pond, and they spray it. Look at them spray this. That's pure manure.
It's amazing that this is legal.
In the picture of the American flag next to that much manure. And when you see, if you've ever seen any of those documentaries that talk about the environmental racism, they kind of show the sprinkler systems, but these digesters right now, I mean, the fact that I got this from farmers, that, you know why that they're showing them is because they don't like the labor of having to deal with the manure. And the fact is the food system doesn't really help them with it. Our food system will pay for this equipment. Sometimes these equipment cost millions of dollars, but it still just acts as though it's perfectly fine to spray it over and over again on land that gets into water and the air. And so, I mean, so the point is that this is set up oftentimes next to communities of lower income and marginalized communities. Communities started suing and were winning, and then guess what happens? The system then created ag nuisance laws, which basically prevented how much you could sue the farm operator for, and required you to pay for the legal fees. So you couldn't win more than, there was where Smithfield was sued, and there were like millions of dollars that were won. And then after that, you can't win over $9,000. It's not that you're suing them because, oh, you're happy to sue. A lot of people have experienced a lot of health issues, and the consequences are, pigs are now outnumbering humans 40-1 in these communities. It causes high infant mortality. It causes more death due to anemia, kidney disease, tuberculosis, and septicemia. I don't actually know how to pronounce that correctly, but I hope it did. It has higher hospital admission and ER visits. And so when people are suing them, it could be a family member who's suing after not only they lost the value of their home, but may have lost a loved one to something like this. And to now, for them to not have any way to fight back. I mean, those are lagoons. Those are lagoons
Yeah.
of blood and manure. It just blows my mind that we allow that to just be sitting there like that.
There are so many protections that just do not exist in a normal marketplace or any other business, like where they're not only allowed to do these things, but like you said, they're allowed to, like how much they're able to be sued for it is capped. And then also, when people do investigations, they're not even allowed to really do investigations to expose when they actually are breaking the law.
Yeah.
So there are so many absurdities to this that it's just like, in incredible that something so obviously corrupt is allowed. And it's because, like you said before, essentially it's
Political
buying
power.
votes.
Yeah, it's
It's
political
buying
power.
votes.
It's back and forth, but also they're inserting their own into politicians. And I just want to give an example
Yes.
really fast of something that, just to understand like how to solve some of this stuff and what lobbying is. And I'm going to go through that. I know you have to jump off. Agriculturefairnessalliance.org, our lobbying group specifically, is, I'm going to go through these sequences, but I know you have to log off the TV, that we are trying to help all of these things change and bring, like I said, fairness back. And also for us to learn how to start inserting our own into politics, because at this point, it isn't just about corporations having their so-called political puppets. It's that, we can as well. We just have to play by the rules of the system. And the other aspect to, thinking about some of the corruption, we have to really get a handle on making sure that if there are regulations that get passed, that those people are showing up and not biased or paid off. Like, we have to create unbiased people to follow through on those regulations, or it's just lip service, right? We're just wasting time passing regulations that never end up, going anywhere. And as you can see, those small farmers across the United States, I mean, they hate dealing with manure. They really do. So it's like they're doing the best that they can. Where are they supposed to take it if the industry doesn't regulate it? They're just blowing it out into the wind. So moving on to how do we solve this? Like, now we know the problem and we know that there's tons of political power. How do we solve this? Well, we have to create local food systems, and we have to support more Black, brown, and Indigenous farmers who typically are plant-based growers at this point in time, at least. We also need to get a handle on school systems because, one of the reasons the dairy industry stays wealthy is actually by forcing our taxes to support their milks in schools. So, again, fairness means that we would provide alternative milks as well. We should provide inclusivity diets like oat, hemp, and almond milk. The school system basically gave dairy milk not only money for dairy, but then they're like, okay, well, let's have 1% and whole milk. Oh, and by the way, let's add chocolate milk, right? Instead of adding oat milk. And so right now, many schools need more options, because having dairy milk, chocolate milk, sodas, or water as your only option isn't a fair option. And so, go ahead.
If I could jump
Yeah.
in too, just a shout out, I guess, shameless shout out to us. I, along with the NAC, our branch, the Chicago West Side
Yep.
branch of the NACP, and our Black Vegans of Chicago group were pushing for a piece of legislation that went through in last session to be a bit broader and to make all schools have to provide vegan options, which unfortunately did not happen. But I just want to say also, we as people who are environmentalists or who are vegans have to think more than just like social media likes
For
of
sure.
pretty pictures, and we have to commit to doing this actual policy work. Like, I'm showing up to like these meetings, and obviously you are pushing these things. We cannot be so gullible as to just think that all lobbyists are bad and that all lobbying is bad. We have to think strategically in order to change these things, and not just like pictures of vegan food on Instagram and stuff. Like, that is not enough to
Well,
change.
vegan food on Instagram is capitalist consumerism focused, and I've said this in different ways, but you can't, capitalism wants us to think that over consuming something else is going to help us gain power and freedom, and it's not when our taxes are working against our dollar. And
Yeah, because we're not even I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're not even really in capitalism here. Like
well,
this is socialism. This
corporate
is
social
socialism for the wrong for the wrong people, right?
corporate
This is
socialism, absolutely.
this
And
is
even a forced industry, not that I'm saying communism used to force industries where everyone had ownership of the industry. Well, if our taxes are paying to uplift this industry, we sort of are all owners of this industry and allowing them to stay in control. So it really jumps into blurred lines of what system is this even in? And it's very different than this sort of patriotic mentality of farmers and of the food system. And again, I'm not saying farmers; it's reactionary for them, but mega farmers specifically. So when we think about local change, some of the things that AFA, well, so I'm going to highlight what you mentioned, and I do have a slide that discusses, NAACP starting in 1909, for example, was centralizing people that were like-minded to do a bunch of amazing things in civil rights over the years. Even the legal backing of desegregation of Brown versus Board of Education. Imagine us centralizing enough money and people to where we had a legal arm and we could take we could represent a small Black, brown, or indigenous farmer against the food system to show how unfair it was. Those things can't happen without centralization or money. And NAACP, while there were, a lot of groups that were marching the street, those people marching the street couldn't have effectively done as much without the political relationships on one side as well as the legal aspect on the other. So we have to be thinking like this. And it's not a new concept. That's kind of what I was saying. Actually, the public was the number one group of people that were members of lobbying groups and were represented by lobbyists only in the 1970s. And I think I have a slide later that I can show this. A guy who ended up being a later Supreme Court justice, he was like a lawyer at the time, and he said, imagine how much power the businessman could have if he just lobby. And now we've lost an entire generation. Anyone born past the 70s, everybody thinks that lobbying is just corporations and don't realize it's a tool that can work. I want to give you a great example. All of the Supreme Court changes you've seen in the last 2 weeks, you've seen or at least the mention of what's to come, all the states having all of those changes, it didn't happen through protesting on their side. It happened through lobbying. They spent the evangelical Christian group spent $350 million in lobbying in 2021. And women's advocacy spent about 1.5. LGBTQ groups spent about 1.5 million, and a few other groups similar, 350 million versus 1.5. It doesn't mean there are more evangelical Christians. It means that they focused on centralizing their money more. How many of us, and I'm just putting into perspective, how do you achieve 350 million? It sounds like an insane amount of money. You actually only need a million people to give like 30 something dollars a month for a year, and you're already at the 360 million. Now, I'm not saying this on the vegan side, but when you combine equally treated over the years, workers' rights, if you combine these people, a million is not that many. It's just that we have to get the population realizing that holding up a sign outside saying, I want this to change, versus setting up a meeting with a politician and sitting in his office and saying, I want this to change, or we're not reelecting you, and here are all the people that support us, is powerful. So anyways, these are some of the solutions that we have. Plant-based vertical farming incentives, any land, anywhere. Other things are incentives to reduce the supply chain dependency. And we submitted language like that to the ag-appropriations that was recently, the timing for ag-appropriations was recent. And then, go ahead.
So are you working on a new bill or something to change these the uh, in the previous Farmer Act?
Yeah. So the Farm Bill a is basically let me go to the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is like the Super Bowl of food policy, and it happens every 4 to 5 years. It's one of the most contested bills in Congress, and a lot of people don't even know that it is. It takes anywhere from 5 months to a year of back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. You have to do a lot of things before you get to the Farm Bill. You have to create standalone legislation that you can prove. There's opportunities to insert language in what's called ag appropriations, which is the spending. And we got ag appropriations language in the previous year, and it's looking like we might get a language in this year as well. The language we're getting is to one of them is farm transition specialist, so that people that want to transition from livestock farming have access to our subsidies, helping them transition to a more lucrative plant-based farming. Renee, who might be on the call right now, board member, she came up with a really great program that helps farmers who want to do that. And we expanded on that program to be a language insertion as well as a standalone legislation. But anyways, so you have different areas that you can advocate for changes. And we are mostly federally focused, although we are starting to lean into some of the states that have a large grip hold on food policy, like California and Texas, for example. But we are mostly federal. To your point about how to kind of make changes with us, I wouldn't be able to walk into a federal conversation. We have to have federal lobbyists to do so, and I'm not the right person. My game is to quarterback people together, like to quarterback the situation where I centralize like-minded people, and then we hire lobbyists who are super professional, live and breathe it. But there are other opportunities for regional and local lobbying where you actually can set up meetings with your own politicians. And in that situation, states have their own farm bill like policies, and cities have their own as well.
Yeah,
So
and I would just say also, the NACP lobbies for different things.
they
Like,
do.
we think about lobbying as these bad things, just innately, but lobbying has a real connection to activism. Like the Chicago West Side branch is obviously a part of the Illinois uh, uh, Clean Jobs Coalition, and so I am frequently in contact with lobbyists who are advocating for this clean energy, and fortunately, we don't do enough on some other clean job areas, but who do amazing things for clean energy. And by us combining our power in those coalitions, um, we are able to affect change. And it's just so much more effective than just going out and protesting. Protesting is important, it is fundamental, but it is only a piece of it. And it cannot work on its own. It cannot work without getting involved in showing up, or collaborating, to sit in on some of these meetings of these environmental committees or agriculture committees. And uh, I do a lot of that, right? And so we need more people to come in to, like, right now I'm talking about our Chicago West Side branch, to help do this work and help make us and connect us with these lobbyists, because we have a role to play, even if we aren't lobbyists, with lobbyists.
For sure. You also are not being heard or holding politicians accountable with protesting. And the thing is like visually, you are seen as someone who's against something, but protesting a lot of times is already after something is passed, and once passed legislation is passed, it's too late. You have to do very proactive protesting, but again, how do you hold anybody accountable, or how do they know exactly what you want done? And so this is a great slide I skipped to. We have to, so at the very least, if you go to a protest, someone needs to be there centralizing like-minded voters, take down everybody's contact information to the extent they'll give it to you, so that you can create a voting poll, right? And lobbying is the way our voices are heard well in advance of elections. You also can insert your own politicians just versus waiting to reactively see who's on the ballot and be like, okay, well, this person sounds like-minded. I mean, it's impossible to know for every single thing you're voting on who everyone is and their entire history. Waiting until election time to decide on candidates is too late. We have to get to the point where, like I said, we have such a strong group of people that we are inserting our own people. And then lobbying is not a corporation-only thing. And this is that quote I was mentioning, the leading lawyer who became the Supreme Court Justice. As every business executive knows, few elements of American society today have as little influence in government as the American businessman, the corporation, or even the millions of corporate stockholders. That quote is so mind-blowing to me. He's telling us that businessmen and corporations and stockholders have the least influence in American society. Do you realize how much that shifted, because now they all lobby? And it doesn't mean that we as the public can't, and we actually have way more money than they do. It just seems like they have a lot because we're kind of looking at it from the degree of one person versus many people. The other thing is 10,000 bills are introduced to the US Congress each year, and none are really voted on by constituents. That means once you've elected someone in, they're voting on these things for you. So if you're not putting pressure on them and reminding them, what to vote on, or if you're not writing those bills yourself, I mean, you're missing out on huge opportunity. I will go through this and then step backwards. Okay.
Yeah, I want to try to close us out soon. I'm so grateful. But I want to give you a chance to give some closing remarks really quick.
Okay.
We are a bit over at this point, though.
Got it. Sounds good. So I created this diagram that needs to be filled in, but it's basically kind of the way to think about overall food systemic change. Consumers are on one side, farmers and animals on the other. Environment is overarching on the top. Centralizing constituents is important, but all of those individual groups make up this whole communication channel and an empowering channel to getting like-minded people together. And then it shows you the legal aspect, the legislation aspect from local, state, and federal. Now, me making this does not mean it's perfect, but this is sort of how I see if all these groups work together, advocating for, different consumers, different farmers, animals, the environment, and then all centralizing, that we really have a huge amount of power. And if you look on the left of types of groups that are like-minded adjacent, health food accessibility groups, plant-based farmers, Black, brown, and indigenous farmers, environmental groups, workers' rights groups, vegan consumers, and animal save groups. So if we do, I do have a bunch more information that, I don't know if maybe you want to pass along to people later. It has the different, the 1 through 5 of, how to change the system and what AFA is doing. But just to go through, in the Farm Bill, we'll be including incentives for plant-based farmer transition specialists. We want to set rules to prevent mega farms from receiving more than their share of bailouts, because, again, it keeps the control in a large few conglomerates. Prioritize more direct-to-consumer fruit, grain, and veggies with their subsidies, and then prevent the greenwashing of livestock and dairy. Right now, they're trying to make our subsidies pay for a 1 million digester to each dairy farm, and that's so expensive, instead of just making the whole situation create better practices. These are the takeaways. Everyone who wants political change has to be a member of some lobbying group like that speaks on your issues. I love that you're connected to the NAACP, and they definitely do advocacy on your behalf. But perhaps, you like riding bicycles and you want more better biking paths in your community. Those are the types of things that you almost have to group together and say, these are all the bikers in my city, right? And it's very similar. So you have to get like-minded people to understand lobbying is effective. And if you don't like politics, I mean, listen, I don't either, but I want the system to change so bad that I made myself figure it out and figure out how to like it. The current food system is rigged and needs urgent change. Key takeaway, our planet is in crisis and we cannot just consume our way out of it. You can't just, symbolically buy environmentally friendly things and think that it's going to change things. In the same way that while you can build power, let's just say for buying from Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, you can build power by buying from Black, Brown, and Indigenous owners. But if there's systemic stuff that are still preventing them from doing that, your consumerism, it needs to happen at the same time as the systemic changes that you're encouraging.
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
it's still good. We're always in favor of supporting Black businesses, but I think you make a great point there that there are limits to that.
Right.
Like when there are structural, systemic, and things are rigged. Exactly. I am so grateful for this presentation. I'm so grateful for your time. So grateful for what you are doing for food equity, for fairness, for animal rights, for health, for Black people, for brown people, for all people. I'm really grateful. And I think this was a really great one. I was so excited to do this. I got involved in environmentalism as an animal rights activist. And so much of that is intertwined and related to health and related to Black people, especially in the way that we got here via chattel slavery, which was based on the whole treatment of livestock generally. So I'm so grateful for it, and it was wonderful. Thank you all.
I hope it was helpful. Thank you for inviting me. And, if we ever want to do a round 2 to dive into some more specifics, happy to do so. And this is my contact information as well as the Instagram for Ag Fairness Alliance. And if you go to our website, there's a vegan voter hub. We'd love to have you join there. If you want to donate or become a member and help us do what we do, we have to urgently push forward in the Farm Bill to make some of these changes. And so as our membership grows, our lobbying team grows and just solidifies more and more conversations and change.
Thank you. I do want to mention too that we will have an action. I don't have it together right now, but we will have an action trying to push for the inclusion of animal agriculture. And I hate calling it that because it's hardly agriculture at all when you're really just slaughtering animals. But you're not growing much. But we will be advocating for the inclusion of the harmful impacts due to these things in the slaughterhouses within the city to be included in the greenhouse gas inventory. So I'll have updates for that. Hopefully you RSVP'd so we can contact you about that. And hopefully you get in contact with Agriculture Fairness Alliance. I expect us to continue a fruitful partnership and collaboration. I'm so appreciative again.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.